Throughout our series, we have studied this exquisite image, Leon Rittmeyer's remarkable model of the temple in Jerusalem, as it would have looked at the end of the Second Temple period. The magnificent complex that you see was constructed by Herod, the Roman-installed Idumean king of Jewish Jerusalem, roughly during the years 20 and 10 BCE. The temple had originally been rebuilt by returnees from Babylon in the space where Solomon's temple had originally stood. But the glory of that second temple was nothing like that which had existed before. Herod therefore sought to create a structure that could compete or even exceed the glory of any edifice in the Roman world. As Josephus writes, Herod, quote, undertook an extraordinary work, the reconstructing of the temple of God at his own expense, enlarging its precincts and raising it to a more imposing heights. For he believed that the accomplishment of this task would be the most notable of all the things achieved by him, as indeed it was, and would be great enough to assure his eternal remembrance. The initial reaction to this proposal, as the historian Martin Goodman notes, was dismay by the Jews in Jerusalem because they were worried that the project would remain a construction site forever and they would lose the locus of their devotions. But, as Goodman adds, they need not have worried, for Herod was one of the most gifted creators of edifices in the ancient world. Herod, however, did more than remake the area on which the temple had originally been built. He dramatically expanded the space on which the temple stood atop Jerusalem, producing a plaza that was the architectural achievement of his age. It was, in Leon Rittmeyer's words, the largest man-made platform in the ancient world, the size of 24 football fields, nearly 145 acres in all. It was, in other words, the eighth wonder of the world, what Josephus called a structure more noteworthy than any under the sun. And the rabbis also agreed that Herod, though a brutal ruler, was a brilliant builder. The Talmud tells us that those who did not see that which this king had created, lo ra'ah binyan na'em yamav, never saw a beautiful building in his life. Thus, it would seem that it is Herod who ought to be accorded the credit for this sacred structure that we have been studying. And yet, there is more to this Herodian temple than meets the eye. Martin Goodman points out that Herod modeled his own ambitions after those of his Roman patron Octavian, or as he was known, the Emperor Augustus, who had achieved glory through an expansion of Rome and the erection of new splendid structures throughout the city. Herod thus sought to similarly achieve eternal remembrance by remaking the city that he ruled in his own image. Thus, before turning to the temple, the entire vista of Jerusalem was altered with the creation of buildings in the Roman style, a palace of Herod's that astonished all who came upon it, a hippodrome, and a theater whose inscriptions honored Augustus. Herod, in other words, reflected the Roman approach to aesthetics. He sought to create a capital of Judea that Romans could respect. And his newly created Temple Mount was the pièce de résistance of his plan. But Jews thought differently than Romans did. They approached beauty differently than Romans did. They approached holiness differently than Romans did. And Judaism, throughout the ages, gave eternal credit for the temple, first and foremost, to someone else entirely. Not to Herod, not to the builders who had returned from Babylon, and not even to King Solomon, who had first erected a structure at this site. The hint to whom we are eternally indebted is this seemingly simple square marked off within the larger Herodian Temple Mount. What is this square? It does not distinctly demarcate a special function as many of the inner chambers of the temple did. Rather, these walls served in the temple to highlight the space, first preserved by the prophets and then remembered by the rabbis, of the original temple that had been drawn in the blueprints of King David centuries before. David, who made the Mikdash, the temple, his dream. Within this square, Solomon, Shlomo, following his father's instructions, had first built the temple area, 500 cubits by 500 cubits. And here, in this square, those returning from Babylon had built likewise. And though Herod had expanded beyond this spot, to the south, to the west, and dramatically to the north, this reminder of David's blueprint indicates to us that as beautiful as this building was, and as much as we mourn its destruction, nevertheless, before we understand what the temple actually is, we must discover who David actually was. For David was a king whose very tale reminds us of a lesson that the world has often forgotten, that there is a profound difference between external beauty and internal sanctity. Let us see why this is so. The most beloved image of King David in all of Western art is Michelangelo's statue, standing 17 feet tall in the center of Florence, in the Gallery dell'Accademia, surrounded by hordes of tourists who come from all over the earth to gaze enraptured upon an Adonis-like David, poised perfectly and eternally in stone. In position right before he launches his deadly stone at Goliath. It is a masterpiece, and yet this widely known depiction of one of history's most famous Jews is not at all Jewish. As Simon Schama has pointed out, sculptors of the Renaissance were primarily inspired by pagan antiquity, by Greek and Roman art. Thus, what is considered one of Michelangelo's greatest artistic achievements today is the nude, muscled David, a sculptured embodiment of regal manhood, a statue the likes of which you would find anywhere in pagan Greece. On a given year, Michelangelo's David is visited by 1 million tourists. It was created in 1504, so let us ponder how many have seen it, how many individuals in the last half of a millennium have had their image formed in their minds of David by what they saw with their eyes. It is the most famous statue in the world, and it is a symbol not of Judaism rightly understood, but of the Greco-Roman emphasis on external beauty. But for Jews, it is entirely wrong, because when we look to the biblical account describing the very greatness of David, the Bible emphasizes all that Michelangelo ignores. According to the book of Samuel, when the prophet first arrives in Bethlehem to anoint the next king of Israel, he sought out someone who looked like Michelangelo's David, tall, strapping, with the makings of a mighty warrior. God, however, sternly responds to Samuel that his entire aesthetic approach is fundamentally flawed. But the Lord said unto Samuel, Al tabet el mareo vel gova komato kimastio. Look not unto his countenance, or on the height of his stature, for I have refused it. For the Lord seeth not as man seeth. Ki hadam yireh la'inayim, v'Hashem yireh la'levav. Man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks to the heart. For true royalty, true glory, what matters is not height but heart. Consider the irony. David, who is remembered as this Greco-Roman image, is in truth chosen by God based not on how he looks, but on his character. Not based on his height, but rather because of what is in his heart. The contrast between these two perceptions reminds us how, to paraphrase Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, the ancient world may have believed in the holiness of beauty, but Jews instead insisted on the beauty of holiness, which is something much more difficult to perceive, but which is so much less superficial. External beauty is always ephemeral, but true holiness is eternal. It's with this in mind that we can return to the temple. After conquering Jerusalem from the Jebusites and creating therein a palace of his own, King David dreamed of crowning the mountaintop with a temple to the God who, David understood, had been the sole source of his own salvation. Thus David proclaimed, "Behold, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of the Lord remains in a tent." David professed his vision of an edifice for the divine to the prophet Nathan, who returned in response that God had refused this request. This would be a biblical instance of a dream deferred and denied. David was informed by the Almighty that not he, but rather his son, would construct the house of God in Jerusalem. Before his death, charging Solomon to bring his own dream of a temple to fruition, David explained why God would not allow him to perform the one act that he desired more than any other. And David said to Solomon, "My son, as for me, it was in my mind to build a house unto the name of the Lord my God. But the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Thou hast shed blood abundantly, and hast made great wars. Thou shalt not build a house unto my name, because thou hast shed much blood upon the earth in my sight. Behold, a son shall be born to thee, who shall be a man of rest, and I will give him rest from all his enemies round about. For his name shall be Solomon, and I will give peace and quietness unto Israel in his days. He shall build a house for my name." Rather than building a temple as a reward for his military career, God tells David that he cannot create this edifice precisely because of his military career. What are we to make of God's refusal to grant David his wish? Is Israel not grateful for David's valor? Were the people of God not saved again and again because of the Goliaths that were slain by this warrior of Israel? Here too, ladies and gentlemen, the answer lies in a contrast between Israel and the empires of the ancient world. In Rome, Greece, Babylon, Egypt, the most beautiful of buildings were meant as monuments to the might of monarchs. Thus the logic of God's refusal of David's desire. Had David concluded his career by building what would inevitably have been seen as a monument to his own might, had Israel's greatest warrior built a temple, the Israelites would have been tempted to see David's lifetime endeavors of war and bloodshed as achievements to glorify and celebrate on a par with their own worship of the divine. Thus, David's dream was denied, lest Judea become Rome, lest David become, in our own imaginations, Vespasian. God's temple in Jerusalem would be built by Solomon. And this clarifies the ultimate purpose of all of David's efforts, including his own military triumphs. The ultimate goal remains, for from Zion shall go forth the Torah, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Thus, God's final frustration of David's ambition reinforces rather than diminishes his greatness. David himself reminds us from his very anointment that external beauty or glory serves only as a means to an end. Only holiness is an end in itself. Only the presence of God is truly beautiful. The temple in Jerusalem embodied this eternal truth. It is this distinction between beauty and holiness, between the external and the internal, that allows us to truly understand the nature of the temple and its own enduring sanctity. The denial of David's dream only meant that this mighty monarch could never see his vision of the temple come physically to fruition. But every aspect of what would eventually come to be had been foreseen in David's own dream for this site. As Divrei HaYamim, the book of Chronicles, informs us, every aspect of this temple had been painstakingly planned by David himself. Quote, "Then David gave his son Solomon the plans for the portico of the temple, its buildings, its storerooms, its upper parts, its inner rooms, and the place of atonement. He gave him the plans of all that the Spirit had put in his mind for the courts of the temple and all the surrounding rooms, for the treasuries of the temple of God, and for the treasuries for the dedicated things." Remarkably, ladies and gentlemen, Solomon, one of the most brilliant men in human history, utilized none of his own creative capacities in bringing this edifice into being, all was only as David had foreseen, predicted, and planned. David would not live to see Solomon's building, but that does not mean that he never saw the temple. Rather, what this does mean is that before the temple existed on a mountaintop in Jerusalem, it already came into being in David's heart. Before it was made physically into radiant reality, it already existed within. And it is this vision that Solomon was obligated to preserve on the mount itself. If Solomon had deviated, if, say, he had made the Temple Mount with different dimensions, then the sanctity of the temple would not have been appropriately applied. David, in the Jewish understanding, created the initial sanctity. He projected it onto the space. Solomon gave physical expression to that sanctity. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why the holiness of the temple always remained within this sacred square. Solomon built where David's heart had sanctified, and every extension beyond that space is still a glorious part of Jerusalem, which has a sanctity all its own. But it cannot contain the holiness of the temple because it was never part of the temple that had been in David's soul. And what that means is that the Mikdash, the temple, existed as a metaphysical reality within David himself before it emerged in Solomon's era into physical concreteness. And this, therefore, taught all of us, Jews throughout history, an enduring lesson. If David's dream of the temple could exist in his heart before it physically came to be, then we could similarly rebuild the temple in our hearts so that it could be remembered until it was physically built again. In this space, in this square, which had been eternally endowed by David with sanctity. This is what Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik meant when he commented in Yiddish that ob der Churban Beis HaMikdash hat nicht vernichtet das idische Volk. If the destruction of the temple did not destroy the Jewish people, it was due to the fact that Iber David's binyan over the temple, which had been built and preserved in David's heart and in our own hearts, over the Jerusalem, the temple that shone forth from their souls. Over that temple haben Nebuchadnezzar and Titus mit alle seire chayolas kein Schlitte nicht. Over this edifice, Babylon and Rome, with all of their armies, were utterly impotent to effect. The tale of the temple, like the tale of David's original anointment in Bethlehem, reflects the uniquely Jewish approach to sight and to sanctity. The writer Yossi Klein Halevi describes his visit to the home of David Rubinger, who in 1967 had famously photographed the 3 soldiers at the Western Wall. In Rubinger's home, writes Halevi, quote, on the wall were Israel's defining images: Egyptian President Anwar Sadat whispering to Prime Minister Menachem Begin tenderly placing a shoe on the foot of his wife Aliza, and many other photos. Yossi further writes that he asked Rubinger, which one is your favorite? Quote, wordlessly, he led me into his study and pointed to the lone photograph hanging over his desk. It depicted a blind boy, a new immigrant in the 1950s, wearing a kova tembel, the conical kibbutznik's hat, his mouth open in wonder as he strokes a relief map of the land of Israel. I call it seeing the homeland, Rubinger explained. Writes Halevi, for a photographer, blindness holds a special terror. Yet this boy, Rubinger was saying, was teaching us that love provided a deeper way of seeing than mere physical sight. External beauty is so often in the eye of the beholder, but true holiness is found and sensed in the heart. For love provides a deeper way of seeing than mere sight. This captures the Jewish relationship with the land of Israel, but also with the temple itself. For the Jewish people over millennia, Jerusalem was the city that had been destroyed, but could be seen just the same. A city far away from Warsaw or London or Cordoba, which still felt closer to them than those cities themselves. The ability to see what could not be seen. How love provides a deeper way of seeing than mere physical sight. This is the essence of the Jewish relationship with Jerusalem. In this vein, the Cambridge historian Simon Goldhill offers a remarkable reflection about the Roman general Pompey, who in 63 BCE entered Jerusalem and decided to go into the Holy of Holies itself. It was in the Sanctum Sanctorum that the Ark of the Covenant had originally rested. But by that point, it was no longer there, though, according to tradition, it was still hidden within the structure of the mount itself. Writes Goodhill, quote, Pompey walked straight in, we are told, to see what he no doubt expected to be a glorious statue to match the significance of the temple for the Jewish people. Romans regularly took cult statues of other cultures and transported them back to Rome in triumphant appropriation. He was astonished to find nothing there and remained baffled by the whole experience. Goldhill further reflects that this story is told by the Roman historian Tacitus, but, quote, it is retold by Jews. History, Goldhill writes, is not always controlled by the victors. The contrast of the emptiness of the shrine and the practical man of war's confusion is eloquent, and for once allows the non-material its moment of assertion over the powerful realities of war and conquest, end quote. Man looks with the eyes, but God looks to the heart. The temple was a material structure. It was once the glory of the Jewish world, and it will one day, we believe, be so again. But that physical temple was truly beautiful because it reflected the sanctity of the temple of David, a temple that lived in his heart and then lived on in ours. In 70 CE, the glory that was Herod's edifice atop the Temple Mount was ransacked by the Romans, and the treasures that the structure contained funded the Emperor Vespasian's building of the Colosseum, a construction meant to serve as a testament to the emperor's might. But in the end, it was Rome that disappeared, and its physical edifices, however magnificent, proved ephemeral. It was said long ago that as long as the Colosseum stands, Rome shall stand. But when the Colosseum falls, Rome shall fall. And so it was. For Rome, it was the material that mattered most. But for the believers in the beauty of holiness, for the Jewish people, the opposite was the case. Thus, as so many monarchical monuments to the might of tyrants crumbled along with their empires, Judaism endured. The Temple of David, symbolized by this seemingly simple square, was endowed with a holiness so profound that no empire could overcome it.